Last year I posted a video advocating for gyro aim to be adopted on every platform. That got about the exact reactions I expected, if not better. I've been able to update my shitposting algorithms to more accurately predict the comments this video will get, but mixed in with those shitposts were very legitimate points that should be brought up whenever motion control is discussed. Some people seem like they just played the wrong games and had an understandably bad experience. With a lot left on the table, I wanted to return to the subject of motion, only this time to focus on the other side of the argument. These are the reasons people gave directly to me for why they don't want to see motion control in their games. Beginning with, motion control is too exhausting to use. The last thing you want to do after a hard day at the mines is stand up for hours on end, waving your hands around, or holding a controller up in the air until your arms ache like they're in a medieval torture device. Because that's what motion control is, right? Can you tell which of these players are using motion? The kind of motion requiring broad movements, which I'll refer to as gesture control for the sake of clarity, is mostly a relic of the Wii era.
Even your mom can play.
Motion was Nintendo's main selling point, so they wedged it into every game they could and heavily advertised the system with a flurry of exaggerated movements, waggling, and generally more activity than an average gamer's cankles can support. And honestly, it was a lot of fun to play certain games like that.
There are several types of Red Steel 2 players. There's the D'Artagnan. The Conan.
But it was rarely necessary to stand or move that much. The remote wasn't a full body controller, and even for some of the most involved motion games like Skyward Sword or Red Steel 2, you could comfortably sit and play them with relatively small movements. In fact, Wii Sports is the only game I can think of that required standing, and even then, you could play most of it sitting down. You'd just be missing the point. But even that moderate amount of effort was too much for most players. One of the lessons Nintendo and other developers learned that generation was that forcing gesture controls is a surefire way to reduce sales.
At the beginning of this talk, I asked you all to stand up. How many of you went, "Oh, cool"? That's your audience right there. No higher than 20%.
As a result, gesture control has been pared back depending on the game type. It still looms large in casual games like 1-2 Switch and Mario Party, but in more traditional games it tends to be optional with alternate button schemes allowing you to avoid it. Pokemon Let's Go is a rarer example of Wii-style gesture controls being forced into a major Nintendo series with no option to disable them, and it's rarer because they know by now that forced motion limits their audience so much. It seems like the only place where gesture control is still welcome is VR, which is now the forefront of motion control. But I don't consider it the future of mainstream gaming because it's a format specifically for people who want new experiences and who want to use their bodies as the controller, and the majority of gamers have made it clear that's not them. It's great that there's a place where the kind of experiences hinted at on the Wii can continue to grow and become more immersive, but for non-VR games, motion has moved in the opposite direction. It's been absorbed by traditional games, using traditional control schemes on traditional controllers. For most games, that means using gyroscopes to aim or to turn a camera, because those are the things that motion is really natural for. This is why I focused so much on gyro aim in the last video, because in my experience, that's how motion is being used on the Switch, and it's how most people are using it on Steam. This is what motion may have looked like a decade ago. This is what it tends to look like now. Unless you're playing in VR, then it looks like this. And if you think this doesn't apply to you because you don't play shooting games, well, Zelda isn't a shooting game and that series has benefited tremendously from gyro aim. Even Mario has aiming in it. Looking at the all-time highest rated games, I count 37 of the top 50 having a form of aiming that gyro can apply to. About 3/4. Aiming happens to be an incredibly common action across a variety of genres. And this kind of motion requires very little movement, especially on high sensitivity settings. I covered this in the last video, but a lot of people seem to have been in the bathroom during that part, so we'll do this again. You hold the controller like no, don't stand up. No, just definitely not. No, just hold it like it's a normal thing. No, just there. You use the stick to turn like usual. Then when you want to aim, you tilt it a little bit. I've had my thumbs get tired from using buttons and sticks, but I've never gotten tired from using gyro aim because it's mostly the same action as simply holding the controller. Even with the Wii remote, you could comfortably hold the controller in your lap as long as the sensor bar was positioned well. I sunk a lot of hours into playing shooters on that system. I know what I'm talking about. I'm not so sure these commenters do. The fact that so many people responded to a video specifically about this kind of motion by complaining about having to stand and swing their arms around raises a couple of possibilities. Either they were just dropping in irrelevant complaints without really bothering to watch, or maybe they actually did try to aim by standing and swinging their controller in the air, like Hank Hill trying to use a computer. Given how much people seem to despise moving around any more than necessary, I think we're left with option A. And people reveal what they know about motion with the way that they criticize it. These complaints paint an image straight out of a Wii launch commercial or Kinect stage demo. Is it possible that these people have never used motion control and are just basing their impressions off of the ads? Some of the arguments are bad enough that I have to consider that a possibility. This gentleman writes that flailing your arms around isn't as good as a button press. Okay, but no one in their right mind would describe this as flailing their arms around, and believe it or not, gyro aim is better than a button press. Unless you're talking about the kind of button press where auto-aim snaps you onto targets when pulling the trigger. You know, the kind I detailed in the last video, where developers have to give you a crutch to compensate for how poor analog sticks are at aiming. It's disappointing to see how many people missed the point that gyro aim is one of those examples of motion doing something better than regular controls. It seems that some people have decided that casual flailing is all that motion control is and ever will be, and will ignore any evidence to the contrary. This is why I described Nintendo pushing gyro aim with games like Splatoon as a positive thing in the last video, because it, more than any other game, seems to have brought a lot of people to realize that motion actually works. But pushing motion control too hard leads to the problem of people with disabilities being unable to play. It's one thing being forced to play a way you don't want to. It's another thing to be forced to play a way that you can't. Motion controls can be a major barrier to people with disabilities or those who have a hard time keeping a controller steady. This is why I'm arguing for motion control in the context of an option that can be turned off. Some games are too dependent on motion for it to be disabled, but not many. ARMS demonstrates that even games based on gesture controls can have optional button schemes. And this isn't a problem with gyro aim at all, which is pretty much always an optional feature across the board. A few people took issue with me describing motion control as progress. I'm sorry, but it is progress that controllers have a faster way of aiming than dual analog. It's progress that disabled gamers have a controller specifically made to help them play. It's progress that Steam has opened up to every controller type, and that Xbox supports a keyboard and mouse for some games. Anything that helps people use the controller they want in the way that they want is a step in the right direction, and this is the thing that no one was able to provide a single counter-argument for. What is the problem with gyro control being an option you can disable? What would be wrong with any of the multi-platforms with gyro aim on Switch adding that same option on PS4? The only thing I saw that even approached an argument is that if developers support gyro aim, then mandatory gesture controls will waggle their way into other areas of the game, with Wii cooties resurging like a virus. Looking at the third-party support on Switch, it's safe to say that developers don't want to do any more work on motion control than they have to, and they definitely don't want to limit their audience. The few gestures I've seen in gyro games are completely optional. They add gyro aim because people demand it. No one is asking for forced waggling or mandatory gestures to replace buttons. No one. More to the point, this isn't about motion control as much as it is about game design. Motion is just an input type. It tells the developer what you're doing with your controller just like buttons and sticks do. Every input type has its ideal use. The D-pad is great for side-scrollers and item selection, but not so good for controlling 3D games. Buttons are great for various actions, but completely terrible for aiming. Motion also has its ideal time and place to be used. Saying that motion sucks because of waggle is like saying that buttons suck because you have to hammer them, or that sticks suck because you have to wiggle them. No one blames the controller when a game does this with buttons, but with motion people do blame the input itself. All of these things are developer decisions. They're ultimately responsible for how your controller is used. This is where Nintendo deserves to take a lot of criticism. They've done more to advance motion control than anyone. You wouldn't even be watching a video on motion control right now if not for their hardware. But at the same time, they've created the biggest obstacle to motion advancing by giving the world waggle. Like I said earlier, motion was the Wii's big selling point and they wedged it into every game they could whether there was a use for it or not. There's no reason for a side-scroller like Donkey Kong to use gesture controls for rolling. But if Nintendo shipped big games without the system's core feature, then people might have said that motion had nothing to offer. After all, that's just what happened with the Wii U gamepad when too few games found any use for it. Nintendo's insistence that gestures go everywhere, whether they belonged there or not, is the root of most bad impressions that people have about motion to this day. But they've gotten better in this regard. The Wii U sequels to New Super Mario Bros. And Donkey Kong let you use buttons instead of a shake. In my experience, most Switch games have restricted motion use or allowed for alternative button controls. But every now and then, Nintendo still thinks it's cute to force motion in as a gimmick. Pokemon is a clear example. Breath of the Wild has great gyro aim, right alongside awkward motion puzzles that no one seems to like. But again, you can't blame the controller for things like this. Take your complaints to the developer, just as you would if a game controlled badly on any other platform. The next and by far most common response I received was a reminder that keyboard and mouse exists. Thanks, fellas. I'm assuming you're fellas because women don't watch my channel or talk to me. Yes, a mouse is the best way to aim. Saying that motion control is a major step forward for controllers isn't disputing that, so relax. The conventional wisdom is that playing with a controller on PC will put you at a major disadvantage against mouse users, and that's because, I'm sorry if this offends you, analog sticks aren't as good at aiming. A few people try to argue otherwise, saying that all the pros use them, but even the pros themselves admit that it doesn't work as well and requires aim assist to be viable. There's a debate on PC about whether controllers should have aim assist, with controller users arguing that they need it to be competitive, and mouse users claiming that it amounts to giving players an aimbot cheat. Notice that the debate isn't about whether sticks are as good as a mouse. Both sides agree that they are not. You can subjectively prefer sticks and get great results with them, but they do have objective disadvantages. Right from the start, critics were comparing infrared aiming on Wii to a keyboard and mouse in terms of its precision and speed. Maybe not as good, but enough to substantially close the gap. That was part of what Valve was trying to do with the Steam controller's trackpads, but a lot of people preferred motion instead. Maybe you don't care. You've got an expensive mouse and one of those keyboards that lights up and you have no interest in motion whatsoever. That's fine. But there are these things called consoles that usually don't come with the keyboard and mouse in the box, because a lot of people don't want to play games at a desk, or use a wireless keyboard on their couch, or play their games on a keyboard to begin with. I'm going to get a lot of shit for this, but this device wasn't designed for gaming. It has its origins in the typewriter, from a time when tuberculosis was a man's best friend, and you couldn't turn your back without someone drinking your milkshake.
I drink it up!
The general layout hasn't changed in generations. You can play games on it, and obviously many players get amazing results. But for games like console ports that don't really need a lot of keys, a keyboard comes with a lot of compromises. There's a lot to be said for having an ergonomic device specifically designed for gaming with intuitive button layouts and analog control. Character movement is one of the things a stick still does really well, and for stealth games where every little movement matters, tilting one stick is obviously better than using 4 digital buttons while holding different keys to modulate your speed. Controllers and mice each have a major advantage over the other, and this is where motion control can enable the best of both worlds. A gyro control scheme with analog movement and fluid aiming is an extremely effective way to play these games, and there are plenty of other examples of similar compromises.
But for a game, as I say, like GTA, where you're going from shooting to your car, what I'll use is I'll have a gamepad and I'll switch between mouse and gamepad, and it's really irritating. But when playing with the Steam controller, I was just using the Steam controller, and it just felt really nice.
If you're still scoffing about what a plebeian I am from your panoramic gaming cockpit, let me ask if Steam's amazing controller support has hindered your ability to play with a keyboard and mouse in any way. No? Have you suddenly found yourself getting demolished by motion users online? Probably not. Then what is your actual case against motion support? Should controllers not advance just because you don't use one? I obviously think that motion is better than sticks, but I'd never say that stick-only aiming shouldn't be allowed or supported. If someone enjoys Splatoon more without motion, it has absolutely no bearing on me whatsoever. I cannot imagine getting upset over someone wanting that option. If your main objection to motion control is that no one should use it because that's not how you play, congratulations. That's the most garbage argument of them all. The last response I want to cover is the idea that motion control didn't work and is now dead. I want to assume that these were mostly from PS4 or Xbox only gamers, because if you game on Switch, or have any awareness of Steam input, it's kind of hard to ignore that motion is still very much a thing. All it takes is a glance at any community configuration page to tell you that. I even saw claims that people like me have been duped into supporting motion like brainwashed cultists, Yes, I've been fooled into thinking that motion was enriching some of my favorite games for over a decade, because I'm a fucking moron.
Now you want to get nuts? Come on, let's get nuts.
Anyone who thinks motion control doesn't work should play the Splatoon games with the stick-only scheme. According to Nintendo, up to 80% of players were using gyro in the original. That's an awful lot of people using something that doesn't work in a competitive game where you want every edge possible. If sticks are better, then you should be able to dominate all these buffoons who have been tricked into using a gimmick, right?
I'm not playing that casual trash, bro.
And why would anyone be configuring gyro controls on Steam if they didn't work? Did these players buy into Nintendo's 13-year-old Wii propaganda too? If anyone has been duped into believing anything, it's the critics of motion control. I saw a lot of comments from people who thought that gyro control is bullshit just because that's what everyone told them. Then they actually used it and realized it worked really well, and were left wondering why they couldn't use the sensors in their PS4 controllers to do the same thing there. And the reason might be this. Developers probably aren't going to bother adding something that a major portion of their audience vocally despises. And this is the point I'd like to leave any motion skeptics with. If you've complained about being forced to play with motion control, you need to understand it goes the other way too. People shouldn't be forced to play without it just because you don't like it. And there are a lot of valid reasons to dislike motion control, but none of them are valid reasons to hold it back for anyone else. Just to recap, some types of motion do require energy, but others barely require moving at all. Motion control isn't just one thing, and it has a lot of different forms. Developers need to be considerate of people with disabilities by keeping motion control optional as often as possible, but as long as they do, this doesn't have to be an issue. Keyboards and mice. And finally, it should be clear that motion works for a lot of people and certainly isn't dead. In fact, I think you could argue that it's stronger now than it's ever been. It's not as common as it was in the Wii generation, but a lot of those examples were poorly handled, and when it is used now, it tends to have more value and substance. It's not perfect, but it is getting better. Modern VR controllers are allowing for better gesture control than ever, and gyro aim support keeps spreading wider and wider. It's thoroughly entrenched as a standard feature on Nintendo hardware, and I see zero chance of it being omitted from any future system. And now that it's available through Steam, it's a standard PC feature now too, and the support can only get better from here. No amount of angry shitposting is going to undo that. Motion controls aren't going away. The only thing that continued hostility towards them can achieve is people being denied the ability to use a feature that would enhance their enjoyment of their games. And a feature a lot of these haters would probably like if they actually tried it, based on a lot of the comments I got. But I'm not trying to convince anyone to use motion, or even to believe that it works. I'm just trying to convince you that this is the worst case scenario if what I'm asking for gets implemented.
Oh, dude, they had a gyro aim, man. That's lame as hell. I'm gonna turn it off. Okay.
There, that was the maximum extent of your struggle with the gyro aim option. Why is that worth anyone getting this worked up over?
What's wrong with you?